let's say we have this code where we have something that starts it, then we are expecting to run something and then a finish to happen, right? If I logged out this code, you will see that we get start, finish, and then whatever we were doing here in the delayed greeting renders or prints out on the third line of the output. Asynchronous code is code that you can't really rely on the way that you write it, the way you author the code. In this particular case, let's go through the implementation of delayed greeting. What we have here is a set timeout from JavaScript, and what it's doing now is waiting for a second after we call it, after we try to execute this code, and after 1 second, it will print out this greeting here. We are messing up the order execution of line 8 through line 10. In JavaScript, there are a few ways you can work with asynchronous code, and I want to show you quick examples and very brief introductions to what they do. So let's get started. First, we have callbacks. Okay, same thing. Start, finish, and then after a second, we get the hello there. Cool. So what we want to do here is implement some functions that will help us to manage the asynchronous nature of what we're trying to accomplish here. So first, what we want to do is update the delayed greeting to receive what we're going to be calling this callback function. And in JavaScript, we can pass functions around in other functions. So a function can be a parameter of this function that we can then execute whenever we are essentially done with the code that we wanted to execute. So what we can do here is then log the finish after we are done with the greeting. To do that, let's basically pass a function here that will execute something else, and that should be it. Want to try it? Let's go. If I run this, you can see that we get this in order. Start, then hello there, and after that, finish. Probably you also noticed that start was printed out, then after a second passed, then we got the rest of the output. Let's try something here. Let's say that start was also something that took its sweet time before actually happening, right? So let's say that we had a, so let's call delayed start and see what happens. Aha. So you can see now that after a second, we get the hello there and finish, and then we get the start. By the way, you can tell that I am using arrow functions in here and a function as a parameter on the delayed greeting. That's just because I wanted to stress out the point that we are passing a function. You could very well do the same here, passing an arrow function, and it will behave the same. So let me run it again for you. After a second, and then a couple seconds later, we get the start. So it's basically the same idea. Cool. So now that we have that, what we need to do is basically treat this delayed start the same as we did with the delayed greeting function, which is passing another callback. Let's call it done in this case. Remember that this name doesn't really matter, but it should be something that tells you what's going to happen. I just named it differently so you can kind of distinguish between what's going on here and then what happens here. And now what we can do is pass another function here that will execute whatever code we have within this part. So we get delayed by 2.5 seconds before we can print start. And when that happens, this will be what done executes, which in turn has another call to an async function, which is delayed greeting, that receives a callback that will execute, printing out the finish when it's done with the code that it's executing. So after printing hello there, it will do whatever you tell it to do via this parameter here. Okay, let's solve this with promises this time. Similar to what we did with callbacks, we need to update this delayed greeting function and make it return something this time. Okay, so we will create a new object here, and it will be an instance of this promise class here. To create one of these, the constructor takes in a function, and this function will contain our logic basically. So let's move that in here. The function that we pass in, so this part here, will receive a couple callbacks. Let's stick to the first one for now, and we will call it resolve. And this we will use to mark the completion of whatever logic we wanted to execute first. Now, this promise needs to go out of this delayed greeting, so we will return it, right? So since this function is now returning the myPromise object, that means that we have available a couple methods that we can use. So in this case, we will use something called then, and this method then takes in a function that will essentially execute whenever this promise is basically done with its work. So when essentially resolve is called from here, now we can go into the then code. Okay, so let's move this up here and we can run it now. All right, so we started our code via line 12. Then this particular tool that I'm using to record is aware that we're using a promise, and it was in a pending state. So when a promise is doing its work, it's in a pending state, and after that it will go into a settled state, which can either be fulfilled or rejected. We can go into those in a little bit more depth later on. But basically the idea is, in this particular case, we got the hello there because it ran, and then we are marking this as fulfilled. That means that it ran the then method of the promise and whatever callback we passed in there, now that you know what those are. And just for the sake of completion, let's go ahead and do the same to the start. Let's say that start was taking a little bit longer, right? Okay, so let's wrap all that logic into new promise that we will return. Okay, and this promise takes in a function that has a callback to resolve our logic, and then we need to call this function somewhere. Let's just call it something different so we don't get stuck with that name, I guess. So res will be something that you will find usually in code bases. So that's where it comes from. And what we're missing now is to actually call delayed start. So let's do that, right? And then since this is a promise now, we can make use of then and pass in a function that will execute some logic. So when that's done, then we can run with this. All right, let's go. Sweet. So now you can see that we waited for a couple seconds, 2.5 seconds, before actually logging out start. And then when that happened, we called the next promise in this case, which was delayed greeting, right? We are returning an instance of promise here, which is called myPromise in this particular case. And after it did hello there, after it ran this part, then we resolved it, which in turn made this function call and logged out the finish part. Okay, so that's how promises work. Okay, so we'll start at this point for the async await solution for async code in JavaScript. And the reason for that is async await are considered syntactic sugar So pieces of code that will allow us to continue working with promises just in a little bit of an easier way. So let's collapse these two. We know that they return promises, and focus on the implementation here. So as you can tell here, what we're doing is nesting the different promises one inside another, and eventually that could get a little bit messy, because you also have the same structure as you would with callbacks in some cases. So someone came up with the async await for JavaScript that will behave similar to other languages, and I will show you how that works. First, we need to use the keyword async for creating functions. The second part to async await is actually using the other keyword, and we want to await for delayed start, and then we are awaiting for the other one, delayed greeting. And finally, we can log our finish message here. All that is left is to execute in order, and let's see what happens. So waiting a couple seconds, then starts, and after 1 second of that, then we get the rest of the code running as expected. So let me bring back the solution for the promises. Okay. So this is basically part of the reasoning that went into adding async await to the language. The idea to not need to nest your code in different levels so that you could get the asynchronous code running properly, and instead making it easier to be read and in turn be maintained by the people who are, looking at the code and seeing that this is actually asynchronous code, but it's being handled more ergonomic way. So that's basically the introduction to solving asynchronous code execution with JavaScript. So thanks a lot for watching, and thanks for sharing. Later.